Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Pittsburgh Law Enforcement Center for a candidate forum tonight, focusing on the race for Kansas House of Representatives, District 3. Welcome to both of our candidates here tonight, Monica Murnan and Terry Calloway. My name is Blake Benson. I'll serve as the moderator for tonight's event alongside Patrick Richardson, the editor of the Morning Sun, who will serve as the proctor tonight. And again, thank you to not only our candidates, but everyone in attendance and everyone watching tonight on TV. We will start tonight with opening statements. Both candidates will be allowed 2 minutes for opening statements. Then we will ask up to 3 questions that the candidates did receive in advance. We do encourage questions from the audience. There are notepads at the back of the room. We would ask for anyone in the crowd who would like to submit a question to write that question out. We ask that the question be fair and applicable to both candidates. It can't be just directed at one candidate. And once they write that question out, if they will submit it to Patrick, he'll take a look at it, make sure it is applicable to both candidates, and if it passes that test, then he'll slide it to me and I'll ask it of the candidates, and we will ask as many of those questions as we can. We've generally got 45 to 50 minutes allotted for tonight's event, so really encourage those questions from the audience. So with that being said, are there any questions regarding the format for tonight? Okay.
Thanks.
All right. As I mentioned, both candidates will receive 2 minutes for their opening statements. And Mr. Calloway, you will begin with your opening statement here this evening.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I especially want to thank my wife for joining us tonight. That's really appreciated. I'll start by telling you about me as a candidate. As a candidate, I want to state up front that I'm pro-life and pro-Second Amendment. I was born in South Carolina, but moved to Pittsburgh in 1983 to work for McNally Manufacturing. I worked for McNally Manufacturing until I was laid off, so I'm very experienced in what it's like to go through some hard times. My wife and I chose not to move back to South Carolina, but also to stay here, and I went to Pittsburgh State University, got a degree in computer science. Again, we had to make the decision of whether we leave here or stay. And we stayed in Pittsburgh and started a business which, fortunately, because of Pittsburgh, we became very successful over the years. At some point down there, I decided to run for the State House. In 2010, I ran for the State House and was elected to the office and served in 2011 and 12. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that during that time, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. And I started receiving chemo treatments while I was still in the house. Because of those chemo treatments, I was not able to continue and chose I couldn't best serve the public in that position. But fortunately today, I can say that I'm cancer-free. And I paid close attention to what was going on in the house and became concerned in an article that was written after my opponent's first year. And she stated she had time to read books and watch Netflix while she was in the house because she just wasn't that busy. Having been in the house, I can assure you it's not possible to do that and serve Pittsburgh well. So I would ask you to think about Pittsburgh, me serving you in the next term. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Calloway. And I forgot to mention that as we keep time tonight, when you have 30 seconds left, I'll hold up a yellow card, and when you're out of time, I'll hold up the red card. So forgot to mention that a little bit earlier. Okay, Ms. Murnan, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you to both the Morning Sun and the Chamber for hosting us, and the City of Pittsburgh for giving us this great space to be in. My name is Monica Murnan. I have been a resident of Pittsburgh for quite a long time now, but I'm originally from Erie. My husband Rob and I chose to come back to Pittsburgh after going to Pittsburgh State University and make this our home where we would raise our kids. We have done that. And our 3 girls all went through Pittsburgh Public Schools, and we're very, very proud of that, very active in school. And we just really believe firmly as a family in our responsibility to give back. And I believe firmly that this community, both as a college student and as a grown-up, has given me so many opportunities that I just don't believe I would have had in other places. And I feel a strong responsibility to serve in whatever way possible. And so I've had career opportunities here that I I'm really lucky to have had jobs that I can do good for others while supporting my family. I had the opportunity to be one of the first people in, when we started getting the Family Resource Center off the ground, and worked there for 17 years, and had the chance to be an employer, to be a friend, to help families in different stages and ages in their life. And I never thought that I would, have that opportunity. Prior to that, I taught school in Wichita in kindergarten and first grade. And I've also had the chance, because of living here, to continue my education at Pittsburg State University, which I think is one of the hallmarks of our community. Over the last 2 years in the legislature, I've enjoyed myself tremendously. I've been called a lot of things, but lazy and not hardworking is typically not one of them. And if you want to talk about that little comment there, I really don't want to take up my time on it. But as serving as the ranking member on Health and Human Service, I get the chance to be a strong voice for Pittsburgh.
Okay, thank you both. Our first prepared question tonight will be answered first by Ms. Murnan. As you both know, the completion of Highway 69 has long been one of this area's top priorities. Although the state is exploring the possibility of a new transportation plan, this is dependent on funding remaining intact, and past legislatures have shown a tendency to defer transportation funds to help fill holes in other parts of the state's budget. If elected, what assurance can you give the residents of District 3 that you will protect highway transportation funding? Ms. Murnan, you have 90 seconds.
Since the majority of the transportation funding, as you know, the transportation fund kind of has multiple different revenue sources. The bottom line, over the Brownback administration, we continued as a state to borrow from those funds. As we continued to borrow, things that were on the list were not able to get done. After ending the Brownback tax experiment, we were able this last year to start adding some of those items back on, or actually finishing some of the things we started. There's a transportation task force now looking at the next 10 or 20 years. The only way that all works is if we have a stable budget. If we have a budget that is consistent, that is based on current revenues, and that we keep the revenues coming in a way that is stable enough to prepare for long-term budgets like highway projects are. None of them get done overnight. And I believe firmly that the loud voices from Pittsburgh are important, because we've been working on this project a long time, and I'm ready to carry the bucket for a while.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Murnan. Mr. Callaway, 90 seconds.
Thank you. I too agree with everybody in this room, and probably all of Southeast Kansas, that Highway 69 should be completed, and is probably one of our greatest priorities in the Southeast Kansas area. I recognize that there's a big need for Highway 69 to be completed for both safety, because as you know, we see that there are still deaths because of it being 2-lane in parts. I see it because of the impact that it has on Pittsburg State University and how it could impact enrollment. And also I see it as a big economic growth for Pittsburgh. So I promise you not to vote on any legislation that would compromise Highway 69 funding, and I would make that promise to you. I am prepared, if elected, to petition the governor that is elected to honor Governor Brownback or Governor Collier's commitment to finishing Highway 69, as we heard a few weeks ago. But fortunately, I will also say that October 27th, the Republican candidate will be in town and will be signing a pledge to make that commitment as well. So finally, I was a Republican member of the majority. I would be able to, at your table, or your voice at the table on any Highway 69 funding when it comes to that.
Okay, thank you both. All right, our second prepared question this evening will be answered first by Mr. Callaway, and again, you both will have 90 seconds to answer. The expansion of the state's Medicaid program, also known as KanCare, has been considered for the past few years, but has not yet been passed by the Kansas legislature. What is your opinion of KanCare expansion, and would you support it? Mr. Callaway.
Okay, I support affordable health care completely, but I also know that there's a need to be able to pay for it. And thus far, there's not been legislation that was written that was capable of paying for it within the budget that Kansas has to operate. I will, as a candidate and in office, consider all possible options to making it possible to adopt a CanCare Medicaid expansion if it's payable, if it can be paid for. Raising taxes to do that is not an option at this point. We've had several tax increases over the last few years in several areas, and I would like to say that we should be able to operate the state on those budgets and just change the way we operate the state with that tax income. Recently it was announced that Fort Scott Hospital would be closing, and everybody is, we're sad to hear that, and I'll be glad to talk about that a little bit more later. Thank you.
Okay. Ms. Murnane?
Yes, I support Medicaid expansion, CanCare. I support it for several reasons. One, there was a bill in front of us. We passed it. The governor vetoed it. There was a bill that was budget neutral. Bottom line is that we have left $28 billion on the table as the state of Kansas. The federal government has collected and we aren't using. In Crawford County, the estimates from the folks who look at this on a regular basis, about $8 million a year in Crawford County is not coming through our county because we choose not to expand Medicaid. We're talking about 150,000 people in the state of Kansas, working Kansans who cannot get access to health care. And that just, it isn't right. But if you don't buy that, if you don't believe that folks have a right to have breast cancer removed, to have appendix removed, then let's just talk economic development. The Kansas Hospital Association, almost every major industry in the state of Kansas support Medicaid expansion. It's good for economic development, and it is really good for Crawford County.
Okay, thank you both. Our final prepared question tonight, and we do have two questions from the crowd that have already been submitted, both very good, but I would encourage the crowd to submit further questions if they would like. So our final prepared question this evening will be answered first by Ms. Murnane. Education played a key role in the 2018 legislative session as the Kansas legislature phased in $500 million in additional school funding. Do you feel that Kansas schools are now adequately funded? Ms. Murnane, you have 90 seconds.
Supreme Court says no. So here's what I think. I think that when we were in session, it was very clear that we had two issues, equity and adequacy. As a school person, as a school administrator, I was in a school today in another county. I understand school finance. I understand the differences in school finance based on where you live. But the underlying theme of equity can never, never, never be forgotten. Every kid in Kansas deserves a free, appropriate public education. And we all deserve as communities to have strong schools. What I know about the adequacy piece is that that number can jump around. The bottom line is, so the Supreme Court several times says, yes, you're adequate. And then the legislature backs out. And then we're surprised. And then we say, well, it's too much or too little or too much. And the bottom line is the Supreme Court is not going to give a specific number, but we know where we are is too low. When we were voting on it, we knew it was probably too low. I would recommend that we had a couple amendments that did not pass this last year that I think would have made adequate and equitable a realistic thing for every school in the state of Kansas. And those were two things. One was to look at the cost of living and factor that in. And the second one was to look at how we fund special education and move some things around so that funds could be used more efficiently and effectively at the local level. So the work continues. The bottom line is we know that these are some of the best dollars that we can spend in the state of Kansas.
Sorry, I fell asleep on my yellow card. I apologize. I'm getting lots of good questions, so I was doing that. That's my excuse anyway. I'm sticking to it.
All right, whatever you say, Mike.
Mr. Callaway, you have 90 seconds.
Thank you. And first thing I want to do is talk about school funding is say that there are three constituents that must be considered in school funding. The first one, of course, being the students and how important they are, and the teachers and how important they are. But most often is forgotten is how important it is to the taxpayer. So all three of those constituents need to be considered in education funding and how that money is spent. And when you look at an issue of whether schools are underfunded, it's not something that we can take an overview of the state. As Ms. Mernan pointed out, different schools, different economies, different geographic areas of the state. It's not something that we can address as a whole. It's very difficult to do. That's why the school funding formula is grown to, at least when I was in the legislature, to 26 pages. So it was possible to adapt to all types of funding for all school districts. I'm expecting there'll be more questions on it, so I'll go a little further at that point.
Okay, all right, thank you both. Our first question from the audience will be answered first by Mr. Callaway, and I suppose it could be seen as a follow-up to the question we just asked related to school financing. Would you support a constitutional amendment to prevent school districts from appealing to the Supreme Court for additional funding? Do you support a constitutional amendment to prevent school districts from appealing to the state Supreme Court for additional funding? Mr. Callaway, you have 90 seconds.
Well, it wouldn't start with the Supreme Court, an appeal for additional funding. It would have to go through the system. But I believe more than that, I would support a constitutional amendment that would prohibit the Supreme Court from mandating funding to the legislature, because specifically the legislature should not be mandated by the court system as to how to spend money. The legislature's got their job, and that's the way the government was built. So I think if any legislature or any constitutional amendment should come first, it would be a constitutional amendment to prohibit, to not allow the Supreme Court to mandate funding of the legislature.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Callaway. Ms. Mernan.
Constitutional amendments should never be taken lightly. Never. And if the question is referring to the discussion in the last legislative session about a proposed constitutional amendment that would essentially create 2 branches of government instead of 3, no, I would not support. I would say that's crazy, is what I would say. Because what we know was that whole conversation was about saying that, you know, get out of my business, you get out of my business. The bottom line, the Constitution now says that the legislature will fund. And the politics behind a constitutional amendment, unfortunately, have nothing to do with kids or communities. And I don't support things that don't support kids and communities.
Okay, thank you both. Ms. Mernan, you will answer first on the next question from the audience, and it too is related to schools, although it's a different part of schools. And one of them, we've got 2 questions that are very similar, so we'll just ask both of them, and I'm going to paraphrase on the first one because it's rather lengthy. But it refers to mass shootings in other parts of the country, and ask what the Kansas legislature can do to prevent such tragedies and prevent a bad guy with a gun from entering the schools. And someone else asked, what is your position on armed guards and teachers in schools? So I'm happy to read either one of those back, and I probably will just to clarify. So in relation to mass shootings, what can the Kansas legislature do to prevent such a tragedy in Kansas and prevent a bad guy with a gun from entering our schools? And or what is your position on armed guards and teachers in schools? Ms. Mernan, you have 90 seconds.
Big topics, important topics, complex, lots of layers. I believe that the bigger picture, the question regarding mass shootings and not necessarily just the school setting. So I'd like to take that on and say, I believe in the state of Kansas that over the last 9 rounds of budget cuts under the Brownback tax experiment, we cut so many things that shore up good mental health in our communities. And that includes everything from our police force training to mental health services to support services in schools and places where kids are and where individuals with disabilities are. We have cut so many things. We have all these holes. Is that the reason for mass shooting? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's not all about just having armed guards in certain places. While that is a key component in lots of safety plans, I believe it's a whole tiered effect. And then I also believe firmly that Kansas is a local control state for school districts, and we have to take into consideration what school districts and local school boards deem as best in a safety plan for their kids and their students based on their needs.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Callaway, you have 90 seconds.
I think that you don't have to read it back. And I do also agree with Monica on the fact that local school boards should be more, have the local control on protection of the students. I don't think that you want to get mandated from the legislature for protection of the students. I think that education funding could very easily include blocks for perceived need that or projected need for security, both in at K-12 and in graduate or in university settings. So I think it's real possible that that could be done. I don't think it should be mandated by the legislature, though. I think it should just be accommodated by the legislature.
Okay, thank you both. And we're down to the final question submitted from the audience. So I would encourage the audience, if there are additional questions they would like to ask, to get those in now, because otherwise, if we don't have any more, then we'll go into closing statements after this question is asked. So this question will be answered first by Mr. Callaway, and again, you'll both have 90 seconds. What would be your priority or focus in regards to reinstating higher education funding back to pre-2010 levels? What would be your priority or focus in regards to reinstating higher education funding back to pre-2010 levels? Mr. Callaway.
It'd be a high priority for me because our district, obviously District 3, it includes a regent school. So anything I could possibly do for Pittsburg State University, I would be trying to make that happen. Obviously funding is a big part of the problem right now. So that'd be one of the highest priorities I would have, is restoring funding to PSU. On what basis? Not like 2010. I can't just openly say 2010, but I would certainly be working to restore the funding that's been dropped off at PSU, which I do believe is affecting enrollment.
Thank you, Mr. Callaway. Ms. Mernan, you have 90 seconds.
Pittsburg State has been left behind. Last year, when we put the budget together, there were some adjustments, but quite frankly, they were just way too small. But I believe as the revenues continue to come in a stable manner from multiple taxing sources, we'll be able to get back to where we were. As we continue to see growing revenue, we are able to make better decisions rather than reactionary decisions. And I think that is the way PSU works. I mean, PSU has done a fantastic job in creating their own efficiencies, raising outside dollars, but we have some serious issues that need to be addressed. One is the pay of the staff and faculty there. And the ebb and flow of that has not been very effective. But when we have a structurally sound budget, not just a little bit of ending balance, which, by the way, we have a little bit of ending balance now, and we haven't had that for a whole long time. When you have a structurally sound budget that is not based on smoke and mirrors, you can support fine institutions like the one down the street, and you can do it consistently.
Okay, thank you both. And our audience did not let us down. They did submit some additional questions, so you don't get off the hook quite that easily. Next question will be answered first by Ms. Mernan. You've both now served in the Kansas legislature. Please give examples when you reached across the aisle to solve problems and/or pass legislation. Ms. Mernan, you're first.
I'm a member of the minority party. I would not be very smart if I wasn't willing to work with other people. And you would not be well represented. So I will talk to anybody, anywhere, anytime. And I think if you ask anybody in Topeka, they'll tell you that. And one of the things that I'm really proud of is during the very difficult tax discussions and the policy discussions regarding creating a structurally sound budget in the state of Kansas, there was a bipartisan group of women who started sitting down and actually finding out the facts and doing the math and making statements like, if we move this over here, what happens to a family that looks like this? What happens to a business that looks like that? And none of us cared what party we were from. It was all about facts, about working together, and about compromising. I didn't get everything I wanted. Nobody else got everything they wanted. And then we started including more and more people. And that's why in 2017, we were able to make some significant changes and turn Kansas back on the right track by putting some things in place that allow us today to say things like we have an ending balance, to say things like we infuse dollars in schools and in our transportation system. And I'm proud of doing that.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Murnan. Mr. Callaway.
That one is pretty easy because the one that comes to mind right off was I served on the Education Committee when I was in the House, and the Education Committee had a piece of legislation coming before them on how to structure pay and reward for teachers, and they had a special name for it, but effectively it was going to change the way teachers were going to be compensated, and it was a terrible piece of legislation, and it was strongly supported by the Republican side. I got to say that I didn't agree with it. I had it was multiple pages of revisions, multiple pages, and we worked on it for the entire legislative session. I was I stood up and made the motion that we trash this piece of legislation, and I received commendation from KNEA for that. So I got to say I did cross the aisle there.
Okay, thank you both. And it appears we are again down to our final question from the audience, and this one will be answered first by you, Mr. Callaway. As representative for Pittsburgh in the Kansas State House, what would you do to address homelessness in the community? As representative for Pittsburgh in the Kansas State House, what would you do to address homelessness in the community? Mr. Callaway, you have 90 seconds.
Homelessness is definitely a problem in Pittsburgh, and I've actually been over here talking to the Pittsburgh police about it. It's a problem that wouldn't be solved from the legislature. It'd be a problem that politics is local, and I would believe strongly in supporting whatever that the officiating groups in Pittsburgh would be doing to solve this problem. And I would support it however I could from the legislature, but it wouldn't be something that would be directed from the legislature.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Callaway. Ms. Murnan, 90 seconds.
I'm glad somebody asked this. Again, another complex issue. No one single strategy will work, and we have to have multiple layers. There's a concerted group of people in the city of Pittsburgh who have been trying to address this issue for many years. And lots of folks think it's a shelter issue. We just need a shelter again. We need a shelter again. Other folks think it's an issue of choice. But what we know for sure about homelessness is that it affects kids, it affects old folks, and it affects folks in between. And it isn't always just somebody living on the street. It's doubling up. It's moving from couch to couch to couch. I think that the legislature specifically could do three things. One, they could provide supportive housing services through the multiple channels that they have at KDADS, Kansas Department of Aging and Disability Services, and also through the channels that they have at the Department of Children and Families. Supportive housing services have been shown to be very effective and actually have been in place in Pittsburgh in the past, and due to funding cuts are no longer. The next thing that is allowable are billing codes through Medicaid for supportive housing, so that individuals who are long-term disabled and experiencing homelessness, the agency that is helping them can actually bill and get reimbursed for that, knowing that that is a saving expense rather than being in the emergency room. And finally, the Department of Commerce can support housing projects through the existing channels that they have and they have had in the past. I would support funding for that.
Okay, thank you both. And our audience has submitted some additional questions. I would have to say this is the most fun question of the evening. What is your opinion on legalization of marijuana in Kansas?
Yeah, yeah.
Ms. Murnane,
Well,
90 seconds.
great, thanks. So this is talked about a lot. As a matter of fact, I probably get the most emails about this topic. I really do, statewide. I kind of see it in three ways, three chunks. You know, you've got recreational legalization, you have medical legalization, and then you have what I would, you know, kind of call byproducts. So hemp, oils, those kinds of things. We did make some legislative moves this year that support the research that shows that there are some significant medical benefits, especially to children with seizures, with different byproducts. And we continually, as the ranking minority member on Health and Human Services, continually hear from folks both in the medical field and constituents that this is an issue they want looked at in Kansas. I think that, and to me, it kind of goes in those chunks. I think we haven't had a true bill put together that's comprehensive in nature, and I would be really interested in looking at that and debating that in a way that we can bring in lots of voices for lots of different reasons.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Callaway.
I think you asked the question, do I agree with legalizing marijuana? And no, I do not. So just to answer your question, was it my turn?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Okay.
I was also on the Health and Human Services Committee, and a lot of people did come forward and request us to consider it for legislation, but it wasn't usually the medical community. In fact, I don't remember one group from a medical community that came forward, but it has been 8 years, and I give you that. But at any rate, there are medical benefits, there seem to be some medical benefits from the byproducts of it, but I don't see any reason that Kansas would need to legalize smoking marijuana for the purposes of recreation and possibly even medical purposes.
Okay, thank you both. Next question from the audience will be answered first by Mr. Callaway, and once again, you'll have 90 seconds to do so. How would you approach abortion legislation at the state level? How would you approach abortion legislation at the state level? Mr. Callaway.
It'd be real easy. I would vote to kill any legislation that would approve abortion. I am pro-life, and I support that completely.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Murnane.
Will you repeat the question?
Yes. How would you approach abortion legislation at the state level?
So as legislation comes forward, one, you have to read it really clearly, and you have to know the intent of it. So I would do that. The second thing is find out all the facts, but I am indeed aware that this issue is so personal to so many people, and it has so many different parts and pieces. But when people ask me, I think the question here is are you pro-life? Let's just get to it. And I've always said, I'm pro-life, I'm pro-all life. I'm pro-old people, I'm pro-individuals with disabilities, I'm pro-little kids, I'm pro-all life. And I think that when we look at legislation, oftentimes on this subject, this very important subject, it's simply meant to be a gotcha. And I don't think that's fair to anybody. And that's what happens sometimes in Topeka. But I am interested in legislation that supports all human life.
Okay, thank you both. And I know I've said it 4 times, but I think we're down to our last question
You keep teasing
from
us
the
there,
audience.
Blake.
I know. This question will be answered first by Ms. Murnane. Would you support statewide equal employment protections for LGBT+ workers and citizens? Would you support statewide equal employment protections for LGBT+ workers and citizens? 90 seconds, Ms. Burnett.
Yes.
Okay, I can stop the clock. Yeah. Mr. Callaway,
Read the question again.
Okay. Would you support statewide equal employment protections for LGBT+ workers and citizens?
I can't say because I don't know that it's a problem.
Okay. All right. Well, I believe we are now at the end of our questions from the audience. And so both candidates now will receive 2 minutes for your closing statement. And Mr. Callaway, you will give your closing statement first.
Okay, thank you very much. I would thank you again for allowing me to be here with you again tonight, and thank you, my family, for being here and joining me as well. I remind you that I do recognize that Highway 69 is a big issue for Pittsburgh and Pittsburgh State University, and I would vote to, or promise you that I would vote to keep any funding possible necessary to complete Highway 69. I'd also remind you that if Medicaid expansion is considered, that I would be on your side on Medicaid expansion, but I would not be, I would be opposed to raising taxes for it. Finally, I would like everyone to remember that there are three constituents when it comes to education funding, and that all those should be considered. That's the student, the teachers, and the taxpayer. I promise you that if I go back to Topeka, I won't spend my time reading books and watching Netflix. I'll be working for you hard and working for you full time. I appreciate your time, giving me the time to talk to you tonight, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Callaway. Ms. Murnane, you too have 2 minutes.
I am humbled by the fact that the people of Pittsburgh sent me to Topeka 2 years ago. I was humbled the first day. I was humbled every day that I walked into that beautiful building. I was humbled every time a kid came up and I got to show them around. I was humbled every time I got to speak from the well and say, you know what, we don't see that in Pittsburgh. That's not happening in our community, and I'd like for it to. There's nothing easy about being in Topeka. The issues are complex. The system is foreign. It's very, very specific to that world. A lot of things happen that I had to ask questions about. And what I did before is what I I want you to know that I would do again if I went up. I try to learn about everything. If I don't know about it, I find the smartest person around and ask them. I make sure that they're right in the middle, that they're not trying to sell me on one side or the other. I make sure that I don't run around chasing things that maybe aren't important to the folks back home. But when I get a call from somebody at home, I return it. When I get an email from somebody at home, I return it. When I get somebody asks me for help, I find somebody who can help. And that's what I would agree to continue to do. I have been known to do more than one thing at a time, and those of you in the audience who have worked with me know this is to be true. And I was not going to respond, but I will respond. What he's talking about was an interview in the Morning Sun, where I was on the floor of the House at 7 o'clock in the morning doing a videotaped discussion with Morning Kiwanis. And we had been sitting for days and days because legislation was being held up. And I made a joke. If anybody wants to check my calendar and see how hard I'm working for you, it's open and available to you, and my phone number's printed on everything, and I hope you'll give me a call. And I'd appreciate your vote a lot.
Okay, thank you both. I hope our audience will give our candidates a round of applause this evening. Thank you again to the City of Pittsburgh for hosting us tonight. Thank you to Patrick Richardson for his services. I will remind everybody that coming up in just a few moments, we'll have a forum focusing on the race for Kansas Senate District 13. So I encourage you to stick around for that.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you again,
Appreciate it.
candidates.